They had plotted for weeks, mapping every inch of the farm, studying the routines of its owners. Under the cloak of night, three men in black cycled silent through the winding dirt roads leading to Old Maple Farm. Its rolling fields sprawled like a vast ocean of green under the silver glow of the moon, convincingly calm, deceptively vulnerable. Kevin, the leader, gripped the handle of his rusty bike, his heart thrumming with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "This is going to be easy," he mouthed to himself, convincing both his friends and, more importantly, himself. What they didn't see, hiding behind the shadows of the barn, were eyes alert, watchful. Annie, a local farmer with a keen sense for trouble, had been expecting them. She had lived through too many nights filled with the fear of losing everything. The farm was more than land and crops to her. It was the legacy of her father, her very soul embodied in the heartbeat of the earth. She took a deep breath and settled her hands around her trusty rifle. As the men approached the farmhouse, whispers floated between them, a mix of arrogance and ignorance. "Just check inside," one of them suggested, glancing nervously at his friends. They were reassured by the faint light glowing behind the curtains, indicating life inside, but they also thought they detected a lack of alertness. How dense could these farmers be? But Old Maple Farm held its secrets well. Inside that modest home, Annie had devised a plan of her own. Rising early before dawn, she had prepared the kitchen with what looked to be an idyllic end-of-the-day dinner scene. The table was set, and the scent of freshly baked pie wafted lazily through the air. Few things are more soothing than the smell of home. In this case, the sweet aroma served as a perfect cover. As Kevin turned the old brass doorknob, he felt an unsettling jolt of apprehension. He whispered. The two behind him shrugged, egged on by greed. The door creaked open, revealing a warm light spilling out into the pre-dawn darkness. The moment they crossed the threshold, though, something shifted in the air. It was like stepping into an electric storm. Shadows shifted just outside the window, and the once innocent dinner setting became a deceptive facade. "Hello there," Annie called out, her voice steady and confident. The Crooks froze, locked in place like deer in headlights. She stepped forward, her rifle carefully hidden behind the table. Her presence commanded the room, and despite her slight frame, there was an unyielding energy around her. Kevin stammered, glancing nervously at his accomplices. Annie smirked, feeling the power rush through her veins. The men exchanged glances, caught off guard by her bravado. They came here expecting a quick score: money, tools, perhaps livestock. Instead, they stumbled into the heart of someone who had fought against the tides of adversity far too often to be intimidated by three petty crooks. "I heard you boys are looking for a score," Annie continued, the edge of her voice a knife, sharp and cutting. "Yeah, we heard this farm's an easy target," Kevin fumbled, trying to regain control over the scenario collapsing around him. She interrupted with a laugh that felt like nails on a chalkboard. "This farm has survived floods, droughts, and even a storm that toppled my father's barn." The men shifted uneasily, their bravado crumbling as they sensed a looming storm gathering within her. One whispered, instinctively glancing over his shoulder toward the door. "Oh no," Annie said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You came here looking for something." In the squinting moonlight, they caught a glimpse of the rifle. Its presence was a stark reminder that this was not some naive farmer waiting for the day to end. Annie had fought alone for too long to allow anyone to dictate the fate of her life, let alone the legacy her father had built. The tension in the room was palpable, an unspoken battle of wills unfolding before them. Kevin's confidence faltered. But Annie only shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. You've already crossed a line." The men stood silent, entangled in a web of unforeseen circumstances, their plans rattling around them like loose change in their pockets. Then, as if on cue, the bed creaked from the back of the house. Her loyal dog, Scout, had just woken up and was unmistakably aware of new visitors. The rich, golden fur glinted in the dim light as Scout entered the room, eyes locked onto the Crooks with a calm, unwavering stare. To him, these men were nothing but intruders. With a primal intensity, Scout moved toward them, low growls rumbling deep from his chest. The posture was clear: leave or face consequences. The atmosphere thickened, raising the hairs on the backs of their necks. "Listen," Kevin blurted, catching a hint of desperation. "We just wanted some quick cash." Annie smiled, cold and calculating. "This isn't just about cash. You took a risk stepping into my life, my home." In that moment, the men realized they were no longer in control. They had danced into a trap carefully set by a woman who had learned to wield her own power much like a well-honed tool. They were miscalculating her resilience while underestimating the force of their actions. With newfound conviction, Annie approached them. "You're going to make it right," she said firmly. "You're going to work this week, help me with the harvest." They exchanged horrified glances as the absurdity of the situation dawned on them. "You can't be serious," one crook snapped. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "But you're going to learn that life doesn't just hand you easy scores. You want something, you work for it." The room fell into silence. A tense negotiation was far from over. A war of wills was now underway, and Annie had stepped firmly into the arena. After a long moment, Kevin sighed, looking beaten. "Fine," he muttered, a mix of humiliation and resolve creeping onto his face. "We'll do it." A smile broke through Annie's stern expression. The battle had shifted, but there was still a long way to go. The next day, under the harsh rays of sunlight, the Crooks slowly transformed. Though it was a hard path, they began to learn from their mistakes. With each hour spent working the fields, past the swaying golden stalks of wheat, they found themselves drawn into a new way of life. Annie watched as they began to sweat, their hardened expressions softening ever so slightly. She saw them struggling, grappling with tasks they had never imagined they would do, lifting bales of hay, working the plow, and pulling weeds from the tenacious earth. In the evenings, they gathered around a fire, the flickering flames illuminating their faces. Annie told stories of her father, the lessons he had taught her, the wild storms and the bountiful harvests. She painted a vivid image of resilience and determination, the very essence of survival on the farm. The Crooks turned from thieves into men learning a craft, their gazes sharpening with work ethic that replaced the sloth of their plans. They found themselves bonding as they had never expected, sharing laughter and stories under the radiant stars. With each passing day, the lines between them and us started to blur. In those moments, Annie realized how deeply fear and desperation could push people to wrong turns. The psychological insight that she was not just redeeming herself, but also giving them a second chance was grounding. The reality of what it could mean to turn their back on a life of crime simmered amidst the sunset conversations. Then came the turn of fate. Days later, when harvest season came, the men found themselves genuinely proud of their hard work. "I never thought I would enjoy this," Kevin admitted, a smile creeping at the corners of his lips. Annie beamed at him, the warmth in her heart shimmering lightly among the rustling crops. "This is what it means to earn something, Kevin." Their laughter mingled with the evening breeze, and for the first time it felt like family. As harvest wrapped up, fate had one last test. A sudden storm threatened the fields. Dark clouds churned above them, thunder rumbling like an angry beast. Annie gathered the men, pointing out the urgency in her eyes. They needed to save the harvest they had worked so hard for. Rushing through the fury of wind and rain, they piled together bales of hay and secured the loose equipment. Amidst the chaos, Annie's steady resolve anchored them, while bond forged through shared sweat glimmered through moments of fear and urgency. As the storm raged outside, the men faced their moment of truth. They were no longer just thieves desiring an easy score, but men willing to protect what they had grown to cherish. They worked tirelessly through the night, united in their newfound purpose. When dawn broke, the storm eventually passed, leaving behind a path of destruction, but within Old Maple Farm, a new beginning laid fertile ground. Though the losses were inevitable, the spirit remained unbroken. Soon, the men returned to their lives altered profoundly, their hearts humbled by the lessons learned under stormy skies and sunny fields. They had come seeking an easy score and found not only camaraderie but redemption. As for Annie, she continued to nurture the farmland and the people around her, knowing that even the most unexpected encounters could lead to something remarkable. And thus, Old Maple Farm stood resilient, not just against nature but against the hardships of life, proving once and for all that sometimes The true score is the journey we share along the way. They thought it would be an easy score, a low-risk payday they could pull off in the dead of night. Three men huddled in their beat-up car, staring at the sprawling fields of Old Maple Farm where the moonlight danced playfully on the crops. For weeks, they'd watched the place, convinced it was ripe for the picking. Little did they know they were stepping into a nightmare they could never escape. Look, no one's around. It's just a bunch of old folks living off the land. We can grab some tools, maybe a tractor. We'll be out of here in 10 minutes, Kevin said, his voice laced with reckless bravado. He leaned forward, eyes glinting in the dim light as he scanned the area. Jake whispered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. What if they've got dogs? Stop worrying, look at the place, Kevin snapped back. Little did they know that Annie, the farmer who owned Old Maple, was wide awake. She stood on her porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the moon cast shadows across her beloved land. For her, the farm wasn't just dirt and crops. It was her life, woven together with memories of her father teaching her how to plant seeds and tend to the soil. The nights spent surrounded by the symphony of crickets and rustling leaves filled her with a sense of purpose, a promise to protect what had been handed down to her. As the Crooks debated their next move, Annie felt the ominous energy shift in the air. She glanced down at her shadow moving across the porch, a stark reminder that she would never let fear dictate her actions. Her father's old rifle, stored safely beneath the floorboards, beckoned to her. If trouble reared its head, she would be ready. Finally, Kevin threw open the car door, his two friends reluctantly following. They crept toward the house, careful not to make any noise, but the crunch of gravel under their feet felt like thunderclaps in the silence. Annie, sensing the impending danger, set down her coffee and took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Kevin hissed, rushing to the back door, the others awkwardly trailing behind. But as he reached for the knob, a sharp voice cut through the night like a knife. Startled, the Crooks froze. Annie stepped into the weak light, her silhouette a sharp contrast against the warm glow of her home. In her hands, she held her father's rifle, steady and unwavering. Kevin spat, trying to mask his fear with aggression. Annie smirked, every inch of her exuding strength and resolve. I'm your worst nightmare. Jake felt the breath hitch in his throat, panic gnawing at the edges of his mind. The reality of what they were dealing with was settling in. He squeaked, eyes darting, desperate for a way out. Oh, but trouble has found you, Annie replied calmly, lowering the rifle just slightly but keeping it in her sight. You thought this was some innocent old farm, didn't you? Their bravado crumbled as Annie stepped closer, the gravity of her words sinking in. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had stepped into a battle that would test not only their cowardice but also their humanity. Why don't you put the gun down? Kevin tried to reason, his voice breaking. We can just leave. I can't let you leave, Annie replied, and there was an unsettling calmness in her tone. You see, people like you think you can take without consequences, but life's not that simple out here. In that moment, something clicked inside Kevin. He wasn't just standing before a farmer, he was facing a force of nature. Look, we're just looking for a quick score. He pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. Annie tilted her head slightly, examining the three men standing before her. You think it's just a few things, don't you? You think this farm, this life is easy, but you have no idea what goes into it. This land has weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. Kevin's bravado faltered, and he began to realize that this wasn't just about material possessions. He could sense there was something deeper at play, a complex story that flowed beneath the surface of her words. Annie stepped back, her grip on the rifle still tight. Here's what's going to happen. You'll work for what you tried to take. Jake exclaimed. We're not going to, Annie interrupted, her voice firm and unwavering. You have a choice, work for it or face the consequences. A silence settled over them. They had started this evening thinking they'd score big, and now they found themselves trapped in a twisted sense of fate, forced to confront their decisions. After a beat, Kevin finally nodded, unable to acknowledge the looming dread, hoping to gain some semblance of control. Fine, he muttered. We'll work. Good choice, Annie said, the corners of her mouth lifting almost imperceptibly. As the three men trudged back to their car, a flood of emotion swept through them: anger, humiliation and confusion mingled with an unexpected glimmer of curiosity. They had come seeking an easy payout, but now found themselves navigating a world they had never understood. Dawn arrived, bright and brisk, washing the landscape in soft hues of orange and gold. As Annie stood at her front porch, surveying the fields rolling out before her like a green ocean, she felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Would the three men show? Would they be willing to learn? Eventually, as the sun peaked higher, their car rolled into view. Kevin, Jake, and their friend Mike emerged, looking more sheepish than ever. "All right, let's get to work," Kevin muttered, head hung low. Annie's heart raced. Perhaps the farm's spirit could teach them something they never knew they needed. They ambled across the yard, unsure of themselves, feeling the weight of every missed opportunity and poor choice they had made. Mike asked, glancing at the endless rows of crops stretching before them. Annie seized the moment. "Today it begins with planting," she said, leading them to a patch of earth that needed preparation. "You'll learn how to dig, to plant seeds and nurture life." As they worked, the morning sunshine kissed their skin, and the rhythmic sound of shovels plunging into soil filled the air. Kevin hesitated at first, struggling against his own preconceptions, but as he dug deeper, something began to shift inside him. The physical labor felt real, grounding, unlike the empty thrill of their previous life. With every seed planted, they stripped away layers of their former selves. They began to see the beauty of sweat on their brow, the ache in their muscles, and the satisfaction that came with contributing to something profound. Jake asked, wiping the dirt from his brow. His defensiveness began to crumble as genuine curiosity bubbled to the surface. Annie paused, taking a deep breath as the rich, earthy smell embraced her. "Because my father taught me that this land has stories to tell. It holds history lessons and it connects us all." The men exchanged glances. Had they unwittingly stepped into a new beginning? It felt surreal, almost dreamlike. The days turned into weeks. Each sunrise found them back at the farm, chipping away at the tasks Annie set before them. They learned to harvest the crops, muck out the barn, and tend to the animals. Every day felt like a new discovery, a chance to break free from the shackles of their past and plant themselves in an evolving future. And with every piece of work they undertook, they found themselves connecting not just with the land but also with each other. The emptiness that had once consumed them began to fill with laughter, camaraderie, and respect. They shared stories of their past, their dreams, and the lives they hoped to lead. One evening, after a long day, they gathered around a small fire outside, the stars shimmering above them. The world felt electric, alive with possibilities. Mike asked, poking the fire with a stick. His face glowed with warmth, reflecting the surprise of their shared journey. "Not a chance," Kevin laughed, glancing at Annie across the flames. Annie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. The transformation in these young men was nothing short of miraculous. They were no longer the reckless trio that had prowled outside her home. They were becoming men of substance. But as summer rolled into autumn, Annie felt a twist of anxiety. The harvest season was approaching, and that meant it was time to reveal her final lesson. It was a test of their commitment, of how far they had come. One crisp morning, as the air was laced with the sweet scent of ripe apples and hay, Annie gathered the three men together. "It's time for the final leg of your journey," she said, her voice firm. Kevin asked, swallowing hard as he sensed the gravity of the moment. "I want you to join me in selling the harvest at the market," Annie declared. "You'll interact with real customers, sell what you've worked hard to grow, and show the world the transformation you've undergone." The men exchanged nervous glances, their apprehension bubbling up. Jake voiced their unspoken fears. Annie stepped closer, her presence steady. Learning is a process, and failure is part of it. With a mix of excitement and fear, they set off toward the market that Saturday morning, the fruits of their labor packed neatly in crates tied to the back of her truck. They parked, and as they stepped out, the buzz of the market enveloped them, voices mingling, laughter erupting, the scent of cooked food wafting through the air. "Just be yourselves," Annie encouraged as they set up their stall, arranging produce vibrant with life. And as the familiar rhythm of the day played out, customers approached. With each interaction, they hesitated, but then the words began to flow. They told stories about the farm, about hard work, about realizing the value of life beyond theft. Laughter bubbled up between them as they exchanged glances, fueled by their newfound courage. Hours passed, and as the sun started to set, the three men felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The cash they earned felt far weightier than anything they could have taken under the cover of darkness. Annie stood by, heart full as she watched the transformation unfold. She knew the lessons learned in the fields would echo into their future, shaping the men they would become. As they packed up after a successful day, Jake turned to Annie, a newfound conviction in his eyes. "Thank you," he said genuinely. Annie smiled, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them. As they drove back under the soft glow of streetlights, they were not just returning to the farm. They were moving forward, towards futures shaped by hope, resilience, and newfound understanding. What began as an invasion of desperation had blossomed into an extraordinary journey, one that would change the landscape of their lives forever. Old Maple Farm stood unyielding, a symbol of transformation, reminding them that true strength doesn't stem from taking but from understanding, growing, and ultimately nurturing the world around you. It was a crisp autumn evening when the shadows grew long and the air turned sharp. Three men sat huddled in a beat-up pickup truck parked at the edge of Old Maple Farm. They had watched the place for weeks, convinced it was an easy mark. Little did they know, they were about to face a reckoning. "Look at that," Kevin said, squinting through the windshield. He pointed at the sprawling fields, the barn fading into the twilight. Jake, the most cautious of the three, shifted nervously in his seat. "It's a farm, man." "Please," Mike scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What do you think they're guarding?" They shared a laugh, the kind that masked their growing anxiety. But as dark clouds rolled overhead, the laughter faded into a heavy silence. Beneath their bravado lay a gnawing sense of foreboding, like a cold wind whispering cautions they were too cocky to heed. In the farmhouse, Annie was scanning her old family photos, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. Around her neck hung a locket that belonged to her mother, each swirl and curve holding memories so tightly knit into her heart they felt almost alive. Time had not been kind to the old farmhouse. The paint peeled in places, and the roof sagged, but for Annie, it was a fortress of love and history. She was tired from the day's labor, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As a farmer, her instincts were finely tuned to danger, honed over years of late nights and early mornings on the land that had been in her family for generations. She stepped outside and surveyed the yard, feeling the warmth of the home against the chill of twilight. Just then headlights swept across the field, cutting through the gathering darkness. Annie narrowed her eyes. This was too close to home. Intruders were not welcome here. She felt a sense of urgency rise within her, urging her to protect what was hers. Back in the truck, Kevin glanced at his friends as the truck's engine roared to life. "Okay, we go in quick, grab whatever we can, and get out." With a shared look of reluctant agreement, they climbed out of the truck, hearts pounding, the excitement blending with fear. They crept up the path, concrete crunching underfoot like glass. The farmhouse loomed ahead, dark windows staring down at them like the watchful eyes of a sleeping giant. As they reached the door, Kevin rapped on it softly, but the wood grumbled under his touch, echoing into the silence. He pushed, and the door creaked open, revealing an inviting glow that seemed almost mocking. The three men shuffled inside, their eyes widening as they took in the cozy kitchen dishes stacked neatly, herbs hanging from the wooden beams, the aroma of something sweet baking in the oven wafting through the air. It was a stark contrast to the sinister mission they had embarked on. "All right, look for cash, tools, anything valuable," Kevin whispered, motioning for them to scatter. They fanned out, hearts racing. Annie remained still, hidden just around the corner, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard their hushed voices and the rustling of paper as they rifled through her belongings. Anger welled within her, mingled with the surge of adrenaline. Suddenly, the clatter of dishes broke the stillness. Jake yelped as he knocked over a vase. Annie took that moment to step into the doorway, a calm confidence radiating from her. The men froze, eyes wide in stunned disbelief. She demanded, her voice steady, almost haunting. They had expected an old woman, perhaps frail and frightened. Instead, she stood before them, fierce and resolute. We were just," Kevin stammered, stumbling over his words. "Looking for somewhat, a way to ruin someone's life. You don't get to take what isn't yours." Annie's grip tightened on the broom handle in her hand, but the steel in her voice revealed her resolve. Mike, convinced they were cornered, backed away slowly. "We didn't mean any harm," Annie echoed, her brows furrowing. "You think this life is easy. I work for everything here. Blood, sweat, and tears go into every inch of this farm." Kevin felt the air thicken around them. "Look, we'll just go." He took a cautious step back, watching the fire in her eyes. "Not so fast," Annie said, stepping forward. "You're not leaving without understanding what you've done." Stunned silence fell over the group. They had expected a quick and messy score, but instead faced what felt like a reckoning they never prepared for. Because when you try to take something from someone, you enter a world of consequences that can't just be brushed aside. Jake asked, confusion etched on his face. "I'll show you what it takes to run this farm. You think you can just walk in and take?" Kevin asked, a mixture of disbelief and fear in his voice. The men exchanged glances, the weight of their situation starting to sink in. All at once, it felt like the world had flipped on its head. "Fine," Kevin said finally, his bravado faltering. "Tomorrow morning be ready at sunrise for your first lesson," Annie said, her demeanor shifting slightly as she turned away, satisfied with her stance. "You'll learn to plant seeds, tend to the livestock, and understand the land." With that, Annie retreated into the house, leaving the men to stand in stunned silence. Sleep came hard that night, with questions swirling through their minds. What had they gotten themselves into? Could they really survive a week of farm labor? When dawn broke, the air was cool and electrifying, as if carrying the promise of hard work ahead. Annie stood on her porch, coffee in hand, feeling a mix of exhilaration and apprehension. Would these men truly learn? When they finally arrived, bleary-eyed and quiet, she could see the doubt written on their faces. "Rise and shine. First lesson, let me see your hands." James, the most reluctant of the crew, surveyed the field, uncertainties of last night rushing back. "We thought it was supposed to be easy," he grumbled. Annie laughed lightly, shaking her head. As they spent the day kneeling in the dirt, their hands dug deep into the soil, a silence hung over them. They'd never understood that farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was a delicate dance with nature, a battle of wills against the elements. The throbbing of their muscles after their first day was a rude awakening. As they sat around a fire that evening, exhausted, a strange sensation of pride and skepticism mingled within them. "Maybe this isn't so bad," Mike said, tossing a stick into the flames. "Yeah, we've made it this far," Kevin replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Annie joined them, the warmth of the fire contrasting against the chill of the air. "When I first started here, I struggled too." They listened intently, curiosity growing as she began to share stories of her father, how he had taught her the ropes, the storms they endured together, and the wisdom that bloomed from the toughest times. As the days passed, Annie put them to work, and with every passing hour they discovered the rhythm of the land. They learned to tend the animals, to plant seeds, and to find nourishment in hard work. And with each seed sown, the Crooks began to change. Kevin found solace in the quiet hours plowing the fields, while Jake reveled in caring for the animals. Mike, who had always thought he was destined for a life of crime, discovered a strange joy in the sound of the earth breaking under his hands. There was something transformative about the smell of freshly turned soil and the gentle rustle of leaves. Each day they returned, sweat-soaked and sun-kissed, they felt a bond form with the land and with each other. One evening, around the fire again, they opened up more. "You know," Kevin started, looking around, "I never thought I'd feel at home here." Annie smiled, the spark of hope igniting. They had fought to survive each day, but in doing so they were planting more than just crops, they were cultivating their humanity. Then came the turning point. The skies darkened as a storm rolled in, unpredictably fierce. Rain lashed against the barn while the wind howled like a wild animal. The men were locked in a battle against nature, tasked with securing the crops and ensuring the safety of the animals. Together, they faced the storm. With every crack of thunder, the anxiety ebbed away, replaced by a fierce determination. They ran to secure loose fencing, gathered hay to protect the animals, and fought against the elements like warriors in a storm. As the tempest raged, Annie watched with pride. They had transformed from petty thieves into men with purpose, and in that moment they became a family united against a shared adversity. When dawn broke the next day, the storm had ceased, but the aftermath left a trail of destruction. They stood together, surveying the damage, hearts heavy with what lay ahead. "We can't let it go to waste," Kevin said, gripping the fence post. "We'll fix this." And so they did. With renewed spirit, they rolled up their sleeves, working together tirelessly. The camaraderie that had blossomed during the storm now fueled their efforts to restore the farm. As days turned into weeks, the labor of their hands bore fruit, both literally and metaphorically. Their harvest began to flourish, and with it, so did their hearts. The simple act of growing life became synonymous with a reclamation of their own lives. Then came the day of the harvest festival, when the fruits of their labor would be shared with the community. The anticipation buzzed in the air like the sweet scent of ripening apples. Annie prepared the farm, washing vegetables and hanging colorful decorations, but her heart raced with uncertainty. How would the townsfolk react to their story? Would they see past the mistakes of their past and embrace the men who had worked tirelessly on her land? As the sun dipped low, the festival kicked off, families mingling, laughter echoing through the air. It felt like a dream. The once timid men stood by the stand, beaming with pride as they shared their journey. A neighbor called out, stopping by. "What's this?" Kevin stepped forward, his voice steady for the first time. "Yeah, we messed up, but this farm taught us what it means to work hard." The townsfolk began to listen, intrigued by the story unfolding before them. As Kevin and his friends spoke, they noticed a change in the energy. They were no longer viewed as just crooks, but as individuals reclaiming their lives. And when the sun finally set, Old Maple Farm glimmered with the spirit of resilience. The laughter, tears, and stories shared that night bound the community, reminding them that redemption is always possible, even for those who have lost their way. As the festival faded into the night, the men looked at Annie, gratitude filling their eyes. "We never expected this," Jake admitted, his voice trembling with newfound emotion. "You each chose to embrace a different destiny," Annie replied. In that moment, as the stars blanketed the sky, they understood that the farm they once tried to invade had become a sanctuary, a place where hope blossomed even after adversity. Their lives may have begun with criminal intentions, but through trial and toil, they had unfurled into something beautiful, a legacy tied not only to the earth but to each other. An Old Maple Farm, standing firm against the wind and rain, became a testament to what can grow from the most unexpected of places, roots intertwining, blossoming in the fertile ground of second chances. It was a moonless night, the kind that blankets the world in thick darkness and wraps the whispers of the wind around your ears. In the distance, the silhouette of Old Maple Farm stood against a backdrop of comets silently blazing across the starless sky. 3 men crouched behind a dilapidated fence, their faces illuminated only by the faint glow of a cigarette. "This is too easy," Kevin said, a smirk creeping onto his lips. "An old farmer and his wife." Jake, the most cautious of the trio, squinted into the inky blackness. "You sure about this, man? I've heard some crazy stories about folks who mess with farms." "Nah," Mike chimed in, rolling his eyes. "Come on, you guys. It's just a bunch of crops and maybe some old tools. Just think money will get." The lure of easy money had clouded their judgment, drawing them to a place where even the moon seemed to retreat. They didn't see the quiet strength of Annie, the farmer who had put her heart and soul into every inch of that land. Nor did they notice that she had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. As the creaky door swung open, their hearts raced. In contrast to the desolation outside, inside the farmhouse, warm light spilled from the kitchen, illuminating worn wooden floors, and the scent of freshly baked pie wafted in the air, a stark reminder of simple pleasures. "Let's move," Kevin whispered, taking lead as they crept toward the entrance. The anticipation pulsed in the air, thick and intoxicating. Inside, they descended further into a world unfamiliar to them, filled with relics of a life dedicated to labor tools hanging on the walls, photographs framed with crinkled edges depicting family gatherings around the harvest table. Each snapshot was a thread woven into the fabric of Annie's existence. Meanwhile, Annie was at the table, rolling dough for her famous apple pie. Years of experience guided her hands, and the warmth of the pie brought back memories of her father teaching her to bake on cold winter evenings. But tonight, as she gently pressed the dough, a nagging feeling flickered in her mind. Something wasn't right. She glanced toward the back door, intuition screaming at her to pay attention. In the stillness, she heard the faintest whisper of footsteps, the promise of intrusion hanging in the air. Back inside the farmhouse, Kevin and his crew scrambled through drawers and cabinets, the thrill of adrenaline pushing them forward. Jake shouted, pulling out an old silver pocket watch. Kevin snapped, frustration bubbling within him. They had come for tools, cash, something they could hawk for quick cash, not antiques collecting dust. Suddenly, Mike froze. "Guys, I think we might be." Before he could finish, the kitchen door flew open, slamming against the wall with a force that echoed through the house. There stood Annie, her expression fierce, her hands steady around a rolling pin, eyes sparkling with resolute determination. She demanded, a low growl emanating from her throat. Kevin's bravado faded in an instant. He stuttered, a weak excuse tumbling from his lips, but he was met only with silence, her gaze unyielding. Annie stepped forward, the scent of pie mingled with resolve. "Don't you dare lie to me. You think you can just waltz in here and take what isn't yours?" The men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly aware of the gravity of their actions. They had underestimated her determination, her fierceness. "Look," Kevin tried again, "we didn't mean any harm, we just wanted." "You're already hurting me," Annie replied, voice firm. Realizing the darkness of their situation, Mike blurted out, "What do you want us to do?" Annie narrowed her eyes. "You think an easy score comes without consequences. You want my stuff." Kevin echoed in disbelief, the concept hitting like a slap. "Yes, you'll help me on the farm and you'll learn what it takes to nurture the land to earn respect." The silence stretched between them, an invisible wall filled with tension. Kevin's bravado cracked like glass. "Dead serious," Annie replied, the glint of determination in her eyes igniting a spark of hope. In that moment, she saw the potential for something great to emerge from this madness. "Fine," Kevin relented, the words leaving his mouth with an unexpected heaviness. "We'll work." Annie crossed her arms, a satisfied smirk touching her lips. "Tomorrow morning at sunrise." The three men left the farmhouse that night feeling a cocktail of emotions. They had expected a quick score but now faced what felt like a punishment, trapped in a life they never intended. The sun peaked above the horizon, burning away the shadows of the night as they returned, ready for whatever awaited them. Jake asked, glancing at Annie with uncertainty. "First, you'll see that farming is hard work," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "Today you're going to plant seeds." The humiliation settled over them like a thick fog as they picked up shovels for the first time. Annie guided them to the plot of earth, gesturing toward the ground that had been cultivated for generations. "Dig deep," she instructed. Her own hand sunk into the earth, pulling out weeds like tangled knots. With every stroke of the shovel, they felt their muscles protest and fatigue settle in. They hadn't anticipated how backbreaking the work would be. Before long, they found themselves gasping for breath under the hot sun, their dignity falling away with every scoop of soil. "This is harder than it looks," Mike grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's the point," Annie replied, her voice ringing with conviction. "You think you can just take without understanding the effort that goes into it." As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field, something shifted inside them. The physical work drew them together, breaking down the barriers that had once separated them. They began to talk, share their thoughts, even laugh despite the exhaustion. "I never thought I'd be digging holes for a living," Jake said in disbelief, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. "Honestly, it's not that bad," Kevin conceded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie developing. As the days passed, they started to find their rhythm. Annie taught them about planting different seeds, tending to the chickens, and even how to milk a cow. With each task, they learned that hard work was deeply rewarding, something they had never experienced in their lives of petty crime. One afternoon, while feeding the livestock, Jake found himself smiling at the sight of a baby goat frolicking in the grass. He pondered aloud, watching the playful creature bounce around. "It's all about choices," Annie replied, leaning against the barn. We all make choices, even bad ones. The men began to open up about their lives, where they had come from, and why they sought quick cash. Stories bubbled forth, revealing their struggles, their mistakes, and the desire for something more meaningful. In those sun-drenched fields, the men transformed under Annie's guidance, slowly but surely. They exchanged the identity of crooks for something more substantial: friends, companions, hard workers. But change was not without its challenges. The community watched closely, some skeptical of the trio's redemption. On market day, their first test would unfold. "The market's a big deal," Annie explained as they loaded up crates of fresh produce into the back of her truck. "You'll have to face the townsfolk." "Easier said than done," Kevin muttered, anxiety creeping into his veins. As they arrived at the bustling market, the cacophony of voices and laughter met them like an overwhelming tidal wave. Families haggled over prices, children darted through the stalls, and fresh produce burst into vibrant life around them. Annie encouraged, her confidence bolstering them. They set up their stall, his heart raced in tandem with the excitement fluttering in his gut. As customers came, they began to tell their story. "This is our farm," Kevin said, a tremor in his voice. "And we're just learning to work the land." An odd mixture of surprise and skepticism flickered across the townspeople's faces, but soon curiosity replaced doubt. As the sun danced higher in the sky, laughter began to bubble up. Questions sprang forth, and Kyle and his friends spoke with a newfound passion about growing crops, understanding the world around them. What had felt like an uphill battle now emerged as a catalyst for connection. Townsfolk started to buy their produce, engaging in real conversations that wove tales of hope and redemption. "You boys did good today," Annie said as they packed things up, pride shining in her eyes. "I didn't think people would actually buy anything from us," Mike admitted, astonishment coloring his voice. "It's because you faced your truth," Annie replied. The week rolled into another, and the trio settled into the routine of farm life. Each day felt fuller, more rewarding. They faced the elements together, rain and shine, while learning the gifts of nature and the strength of standing shoulder to shoulder. But it was a bittersweet evening when the weight of their past pressed back in. A local reporter arrived, asking questions, curious to interview the former crooks turned farmers. As they stood against the backdrop of their hard work, unease coiled in their stomachs. Would they be labeled forever by their past, or could they embrace this new life? Kevin stepped forward, swallowing hard while glancing at Annie, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, mistakes were made. The reporter nodded thoughtfully, capturing their sincerity. "All I can ask for is the chance to do better," Kevin replied, sincerity flooding his words. The community began gathering, listening as he recounts their journey from arrogance to humility. The atmosphere shifted, and hope shimmered in the air. With each story and shared experience, walls crumbled, giving way to a foundation built on trust and new beginnings. As time moved forward, the headlines slowly shifted. Instead of thieves, they became heroes of their own story, champions of transformation. The townsfolk began to embrace them fully as valuable members of the community that ultimately led to friendship and understanding. Then came the Harvest Festival, a celebration of the year's toil and triumph. The farm brimmed with laughter, music, and the camaraderie born from shared efforts. As darkness fell and the stars dotted the sky, the air felt thick with excitement and gratitude. Kevin, Jake, and Mike stood behind their stall, watching families gather to taste the fruits of their labor. "I can't believe we're here," Jake whispered. "This is just the beginning," Annie said, a proud smile lighting her face. Under the vast expanse of stars, the men realized they were no longer the crooks they once were. They were cultivators of life, weaving their paths anew. They had faced the darkness, dug deep into the earth, and found something unexpectedly beautiful: a chance for redemption woven into the tapestry of their existence. In that moment, as laughter rang out under the starlit sky, they knew they had truly become part of Old Maple Farm, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. They had learned that life isn't just about taking. It's about giving back, nurturing what you love, and finding your way through even the darkest nights. It was a night steeped in shadows, the kind that thickened the air and made even the bravest souls second-guess their choices. Underneath a cloud-choked sky, Three men crouched behind a rickety fence, their breaths shallow with the thrill of anticipation and fear. Old Maple Farm loomed before them, an ancient sentinel said to hold treasure beyond imagination. "I can't believe we're doing this," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "Stop being a coward," Kevin snapped, his eyes glistening with reckless ambition. "This is the easiest score we've ever seen." Jake shifted uneasily, scanning the vast expanse of fields draped in darkness. "They're farmers, not gangsters. Just keep your head down and follow my lead," Kevin growled, inching toward the creaking door of the farmhouse. Adrenaline rushed through them, a cocktail of excitement and dread. They hadn't come here to ponder the morality of their actions. They had come for quick cash, for an easy out. As they slipped inside, the warm glow of an inviting kitchen greeted them, a stark contrast to their dark intentions. The aroma of baked bread filled the air, and the last rays of daylight trickled through the window. They moved cautiously, hearts thudding beneath their jackets. "Look at this place," Kevin whispered, rifling through a drawer filled with old cutlery and mismatched plates. Suddenly, the back door swung open, and in stepped Annie the farmer, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes sparkled with the fire of a woman who had faced trials far beyond her years. She had lived on this land since she was a child, and now it was a sanctuary, a legacy she wouldn't allow anyone to tarnish. She demanded, stepping forward, her voice steady as steel. Caught off guard, the men froze, the gravity of their situation crashing over them like a wave. Kevin's bravado flickered. We." Annie's eyes narrowed. "Lost in your own greed." In that moment something shifted in the air. There was an unyielding strength about her, a willingness to protect her land at all costs. It hit them like a slap across the face. "Look, we didn't mean any harm," Jake stammered, backing away, fear twisting his gut. Annie crossed her arms. "Not harm. You've invaded my home, my sanctuary. You think you can just take." With her heart racing, she mentally prepared for what came next. A woman of the earth, she had dealt with storms, droughts, and unyielding hardships, but this felt different. Now she faced three men darting between bravado and dread, and she had a choice to make. As if instinctively, Kevin felt the fight-or-flight response surge within him. He asked, his tone softer now, realization creeping in. "You want something, you'll work for it," Annie declared with fierce determination. Mike's voice broke, disbelief evident on his face. "You heard me," she replied, her stance steady. "You'll learn the value of hard work and respect for the land." The men exchanged glances, grappling with the reality of their situation. They were criminals, not farmers, but even criminals understand fear of consequences. "Fine. We'll work," Kevin said, the words slipping out like a reluctant promise. "Tomorrow morning at sunrise, be there." "I'll show you what it takes to grow something," Annie replied firmly, no hint of doubt in her voice. As they stumbled out of the farmhouse under the cloak of darkness, adrenaline gave way to anxiety. They had come for an easy score, only to be confronted with something far more complex. They were about to step into a world they had never considered. Dawn broke with a golden light, illuminating the fields that seemed to stretch out forever. It felt like walking into a different reality, one filled with possibility and hard labor. "All right, first things first. You'll learn to plant seeds," Annie instructed, her voice clear and confident. Jake echoed, glancing at the rows of earthy soil. "Harder than you think," she smiled slightly, sensing their skepticism. The men knelt hesitantly, shovels sinking into the soil for the first time. They dug deeper, feeling the earth give way, lungs filled with the rich, loamy scent of life rising beneath their fingertips. As the sun climbed higher, their muscles began to ache, exhaustion creeping in faster than anticipated. Sweat dripped from their brows, and the realization hit them. This wasn't just about taking, it was about effort. Kevin began, glancing at the others. "That's because you've never worked for anything in your life," Annie replied, her tone encouraging but firm. Throughout the day, they fought fatigue and histories of poor choices, struggling to adapt to the relentless demands of farm life. Yet as they faced the hard work, a strange camaraderie began to blossom between them. When they returned to the farmhouse for the evening, exhausted and dirty, an unexpected laughter bubbled forth. "Good," Jake admitted, taking a deep breath. "Good," Mike challenged, wiping dirt from his forehead. Yeah, well, I've had my share of crazy, Jake replied, a newfound glimmer in his eyes. And so the days passed, the trio diving into the rhythm of farm life, planting seeds, feeding the chickens, and learning the intricacies of nurturing living things. They discovered the connection between the land and their own spirit, slowly shedding layers of their old selves. Annie's steady guidance offered them insights not just into farming but into themselves. You see, she explained one afternoon while teaching them how to tend to the crops, it's not just about work, it's about choice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they would gather around the fire, sharing stories of their lives, their mistakes, and the dreams they'd buried under layers of shame. It dawned on them that they had arrived at a crucial crossroads. I never thought I'd end up here, Kevin said one night, staring into the flames. Now you're learning, Annie interrupted gently. But change doesn't come easily, and the past isn't something that can be erased. One evening, as they harvested vegetables, a storm rolled in dark clouds swirling ominously above. Annie's heart raced. We need to secure the barn and the crops. They leaped into action, racing against time as the winds picked up. The stakes were high, and the storm hit with a fury they couldn't have possibly prepared for. Rope and tarps flew as they battled against rain that came in sheets. The sound was deafening as thunder rumbled like a drum above them, but they remained united, focused, driven by a shared purpose. Annie shouted, her voice a rallying cry. They anchored the tarps down, fighting the wild tempest as if their lives depended on it. And in that turmoil, something shifted. The transformation they had undergone past Crooks finding value in hard labor became apparent. They were in this together, no longer just solitary beings lost in their individual struggles. They were a team facing life with newfound courage. When the storm finally passed, they emerged, soaked yet triumphant. The sight that greeted them was both heartbreaking and humbling. It would take hard work to recover, but together they'd face it head-on. The days following were difficult, grappling with what they had lost, but the farm became a classroom where resilience was their most valuable lesson. They restored what the storm had taken and learned to appreciate every crop that fought to thrive. Amid their struggle, the community began to notice. The townsfolk had seen the transformation over the weeks, the evolution of the Crooks known for petty theft into hardworking men who cared deeply about the land. Whispers spread, and curiosity grew. At the next market day, Annie encouraged them to showcase what they had cultivated together. People want to see who you've become, she told them, her eyes filled with determination. As they set up their stall of produce, their hearts raced. Mike worried, fear creeping back. Everyone deserves a second chance, Annie reassured them, her voice calm. The market bustled with life, laughter echoing around them as they served their fruits of labor, fresh vegetables and herbs, grown with sweat and heart. Slowly, townsfolk began to approach, intrigued by the pride shining in their eyes. You boys did well here, one neighbor remarked, eyeing them with a budding curiosity. Look at this. Encouraged, they began sharing their story, their journey from being thieves to learning the backbreaking labor that came with farming. I didn't think I'd enjoy this kind of work, Kevin admitted, surprise coloring his voice. As the day unfolded, an unexpected warmth blossomed within them, a sense of belonging that they had longed for. Laughter and understanding filled the air, weaving connections that tied them back to the community. Later that evening, as the sun set over the farm, they gathered under the stars. It felt unnatural to be so far removed from what they once were. They had chosen growth over stagnation, and the weight of their past began to feel manageable. Days turned into months, and as summer faded into fall, their efforts bore fruit literally and metaphorically. They hosted harvest festivals and welcomed neighbors to the farm, not as crooks looking for handouts but as men striving to rise again. Each story shared under the night sky brought healing, stitching together the torn fabric of their existence. They had set out to steal but were swept into a greater purpose, a legacy of their own making. One crisp autumn day, as they gathered to harvest the last of the crops, Kevin turned to Annie, sincerity etched across his face. His eyes glimmered with something new, something profound. It's not just about what we reap from the ground. It's about who we become while sowing those seeds, Annie replied, deeply moved. and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they stood as a testament to what could grow from the deepest of soil's hope, redemption, and the unwavering spirit of resilience. They had come thinking the farm was an easy score but had found something far more profound and fulfilling, a second chance at life. An old maple farm, once a target for thieves, became a sanctuary for new beginnings, a place where every soul learned that real wealth is found in hard-won triumphs and the connections forged along the way. "Get in." The frantic whisper of Kevin echoed in the darkness. They crouched behind a weathered fence, the moonlight casting sharp shadows that danced around them. Their target loomed ahead, Old Maple Farm, an untouched expanse where the wild grass rustled and secrets stretched out like the fields that seemed to stretch to infinity. "This is going to be a cakewalk," Kevin added, his eyes gleaming with greed as they monitored the dilapidated barn and the farmhouse. "Just an old couple," Jake interjected, his voice tight with anxiety. "Relax, man," Mike said, trying to appear confident, but his palms were clammy. "It's just a few tools, maybe some old cash." As they awaited the signal to charge, the stillness around them felt alive. A distant owl hooted, and the sound was swallowed into the darkness. Each rustle of grass made their hearts race, instant reminders that this wasn't just about cash. It was a dance with danger. With a nod from Kevin, they moved. They slipped through the gate, and every crack of gravel underfoot felt like thunder rumbling in their ears. The porch greeted them like a looming specter, and the door hung slightly open, creaking as if inviting them in. Inside, the kitchen was warm and saturated with the scent of freshly baked pie. The walls were adorned with photos of family gatherings, laughter frozen in time, a life that had thrived here. Annie, the farmer, stood at the counter. She wiped her hands on a flour-dusted apron and looked toward the door. A feeling of dread twisted in her stomach as she sensed something off. After years of living and working this land, her instincts screamed trouble. Before she could react, the men burst into the kitchen. Their faces displayed an unsettling mix of anticipation and panic. She demanded, her voice steady and authoritative. Caught off guard, Kevin stammered, "We didn't mean. We just spread out." Jake shouted, already rifling through drawers, his fingers trembling with a mix of adrenaline and fear. Annie's heart raced. Mike, nervously glancing around, stumbled back into a shelf, rattling the dishes. Panic flared in Kevin's eyes as he realized the gravity of their actions. The thrill of a simple score morphed into the reality of breaking and entering. Jake yelled, desperation crawling into his voice, "We can just leave." Annie's gaze hardened. "You're already hurting me. We don't want any trouble, we just wanted to score big," Kevin croaked, backing away as he saw the fire in her eyes. "Score big." Annie replied, her voice cool, unyielding. "You want something." The men were immobilized in shocked silence. They had envisioned a simple crime spree, yet this confrontation thrust them into unknown territory. Mike finally managed to ask. "I'll give you a chance," Annie said, drawing herself up taller. "You'll work on this farm and learn what it really means to care for something. You'll understand the worth of hard work." Kevin, the bravado fading fast, turned to his friends. "We'll work." Annie stepped closer, her eyes fierce. "You want out?" Warily, they exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't turning out how they had imagined. But in that moment, something inside Kevin began to soften. Maybe they could turn this around. "Fine," he said finally, his voice strained. "Tomorrow morning at sunrise, then," Annie replied firmly. They left the farmhouse in a daze, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on their shoulders. Craving the easy life had led them into a perilous situation, one that demanded more perseverance than they ever expected. At dawn, they stood at the barn, hearts pounding. The air was crisp, filled with the musty aroma of the earth waking from its slumber. Annie emerged with a determined stride. "First lesson, planting seeds. It all starts here," she said, guiding them to a row of freshly tilled earth. Jake murmured, skepticism clouding his expression. "Simple doesn't mean easy," Annie warned. They knelt in the dirt, their hands fresh with earth as they pressed the seeds into the soil. The sun washed over them, transforming labor into sweat-soaked toil. The minutes turned to hours, their muscles protested, each sting awakening them to the reality of hard work. By midday, exhaustion weighed heavy, shadows painting their faces with fatigue. Mike lamented, wiping sweat from his brow. Because we're idiots, Kevin replied, leaning back on his heels. But this is. Annie observed them with cautious excitement. This is just the beginning. You have to understand that everything worth having requires effort. As sun dipped low, the conversations blossomed between sweat and laughter, surprising even them. Over the next few days, they became more accustomed to farm life. They swapped stories while hauling hay, learning about each other's struggles, about their choices that led them down this path of crime. I never thought I'd find solace up to my elbows in dirt, Jake admitted one evening, a grin breaking through his weariness. He gestured around. They gathered around the evening fire, the crackling flames casting shadows on their tired faces. Each moment spent together began to stitch a bond, bridging the gap between thieves and farmers. Days turned into weeks, and as they worked side by side, they felt a shift within themselves. They were no longer just trying to escape their past, they were actively shaping their future. Annie watched them with fascination, sensing their transformation. "You boys are becoming part of something greater," she told them, her tone imbued with warmth. And then one stormy afternoon, with clouds brimming overhead, the tension snapped. "Annie," Kevin shouted as rain poured in torrents. "Move," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. As they dashed against the storm, a fierce wind swirled around them, threatening to rip them apart. They fought against nature, securing loose items, tying down the barn's doors. In that moment a bond deepened, and they realized this was more than just farming. It was a battle against life itself, a shared battle. Each raindrop felt like a cleansing baptism, washing away their past, stretching threads of hope into the fabric of survival. When the storm passed, they appeared battered and soaked. But their spirits surged with adrenaline and camaraderie. "Did we really just battle a storm?" Mike shouted, laughter spilling from him. "Yes," Jake chimed in, disbelief mixed with pride lighting his face. Annie watched their faces glow with fulfillment, witnessing the change they'd undergone. They had become a part of the land, not merely trespassers looking for easy scores. They were protectors dedicated to this land, its stories, and its roots. But old habits die hard. A local reporter caught wind of their story and came to visit, wanting to know how such notorious crooks turned into honest farmers. The reporter arrived, curious and skeptical, peering closely as they stood together outside the barn. Hesitation gnawed at their hearts, but they were ready. "Look," Kevin began, a serious edge in his voice. "We messed up." As the camera captured their sincerity, hope bloomed between them like wildflowers. They began to share their stories, feeling the weight lift, transforming their narrative into one of redemption. "I didn't expect to enjoy working the land, let alone learn from it," Jake shared. The reporter nodded, excitement sparking at the unfolding tales of redemption. A local from the community passed by and paused, listening intently. "You boys are doing the right thing," he said with conviction. "People see your effort." Days blurred together and seasons began to shift. The crops grew tall, ripe for harvest, and the bonds woven among the group flourished. Old Maple Farm had transformed, becoming a haven of growth, both of crops and of men who learned to care. The harvest festival approached, and with it a surge of excitement filled the air. "This is our first festival," Annie announced, pride bubbling in her chest. Kevin's voice trembled slightly. "What if they don't accept us?" "What matters now is what you've become," Annie said, her tone reassuring. As they set up their stall, nervously arranging the fruits of their hard work, doubt flickered beneath the surface. And then the people came. Families, friends, neighbors, all curious about the farm that had reclaimed its former glory. One woman exclaimed, marveling at the vibrant harvest. Slowly, they began sharing their journey, revealing the raw honesty behind the transition, not just as farmers, but as individuals seeking redemption. The festival erupted into laughter, chatter, and joy. For the first time, they could feel acceptance wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Later that evening, as the sun set, they gathered back at the farmhouse, hearts heavy with gratitude and hope. "I can't believe we're standing here," Kevin said, looking around at the faces that had turned from anger to curiosity, from scorn to respect. Annie smiled. "This is the beauty of change. You took the hardest road and emerged stronger for it." As the stars began to twinkle overhead, they reflected on everything they had endured. They had left their lives of crime behind, taking root in a world that demanded effort and honesty. And from their hands, they had cultivated not just crops but a future. In that moment, standing together under the vast canopy of stars, they understood that true wealth is not found in easy scores, but through hard work, transformation, and the unbreakable bonds they forged along the way. Old Maple Farm, once targeted for theft, had become a monument to resilience and growth, a living testament to healing even the most broken of souls. The command sliced through the night as shadows swirled around the three men crouched low behind the rusted gate of Old Maple Farm. It was autumn, the crisp air electric with anticipation, and the stars above seemed to watch like silent sentinels. "I can't believe we're doing this," Jake murmured, his voice a nervous whisper. He glanced around, half expecting a patrol car to roll down the dirt road at any moment. "Exactly," Kevin shot back, his eyes gleaming with a manic thrill. "No one around to stop us." As Mike fumbled with the backpack full of tools, his heart raced. He thought about the thrill of the heist, the quick cash they would pocket, and the lives they could buy back from their mistakes. But beneath that excitement lay an undercurrent of unease, a haunting whisper that maybe, just maybe, the risk was too great. "Once we're in, grab what we can," Kevin instructed, his tone carrying an edge of urgency as he led the charge toward the porch. The men trailed behind him, adrenaline coursing through their veins, their fingers itching to snatch the potential riches that awaited them within the old farmhouse. They lurked in the shadows, jumping at every creak of the boards beneath their feet. With a shaky breath, Kevin pushed the door open. It swung wide, revealing a quaint kitchen illuminated by a soft, inviting light. The aroma of something warm wafted through the air, laced with cinnamon and sugar, a stark contrast to the darkness of their intentions. Jake hissed, peeking inside. As they stepped inside, every creak of the floor felt like an alarm bell ringing in their ears. Pictures hung on the walls, faded memories of family gatherings filled with laughter, moments lost to time. This wasn't just another target, this was someone's life, their history laid bare for them to see. Kevin shouted, ripping through drawers. But as they rifled through the contents, it quickly became clear that picking the lock to this little slice of life wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. There were no cash stashes or shiny valuables, just pots, old utensils, and family albums. "Man, this is a bust," Mike grumbled, visibly frustrated as he kicked at a discarded chair. Suddenly the door swung open, revealing Annie, the farmer older than they expected, her stance sturdy and commanding, dressed in a worn plaid shirt and faded jeans. A cup of steaming tea rested in her hands, and her eyes burned with a fierceness that shook the young men to their core. She demanded, her voice low but powerful. The trio froze. Kevin's bravado vanished, replaced with shock. We," she interrupted, stepping forward with a fierce intensity. Jake stepped back. "No harm, lady." "We didn't mean, your easy score is going to cost you," Annie declared, voice firm. Kevin's heart raced. Panic flooded his senses, pulling him back from the edge of desperation. "I want you to work," she shot back, her hands clenched. "You want something from me." Mike blinked, incredulity etched across his face. "You can't be serious." He thundered, interrupting him. "You've taken enough. Now you'll learn what it means to give back, to understand the value of sweat and tears." The men exchanged shocked glances, confusion mingling with fear. They had come seeking a score without thinking about the consequences, but now they stood at a crossroad, faced with a challenge they hadn't anticipated. "Fine," Kevin said finally, a tinge of defiance creeping into his voice. "We'll do it." Annie smirked, noting the shift in their energy. "Tomorrow at dawn." They stumbled out of the farmhouse, the reality of their situation sinking in like a stone in their chests. This wasn't about robbery anymore. It was about survival and grasping at a second chance they dared not dream of. Dawn broke, casting a warm amber light over Old Maple Farm as the men arrived the next morning. The cool air held a promise mixed with uncertainty, each breath they took feeling heavier than the last. "All right, your first task is simple but crucial." "We're planting seeds today," Annie instructed, her tone steady. Mike scoffed, shooting a glance at Kevin. Annie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Planting seeds is just the beginning." As they knelt in the earth, shovels sinking into the soil, silence enveloped them. The sun warmed their backs, but their minds flickered with doubt. Digging was harder than they thought, and soon their muscles ached from the sheer labor of it. "This sucks," Jake muttered after the first hour, beads of sweat trickling down his face. "Because we were idiots," Kevin replied, struggling to catch his breath. As they worked, Annie watched, noting the dynamics unfold. They'd begun as petty thieves, but beneath layers of bravado lay men yearning for redemption. She felt a tinge of hope spark within her. There was potential hidden beneath that facade of ignorance. By mid-afternoon, they slumped against the barn, exhaustion weighing heavily on their shoulders. The sun beat down relentlessly, and with it came a growing camaraderie as they shared their stories. "I never thought I would end up planting seeds after trying to steal," Kevin said wryly, "but, believe me, we all come from rough patches," Annie pointed out, her voice softer now. Day after day blended into a blur of hard work and laughter as the men began to find their rhythm. They tended to the crops, fed the chickens, and even picked vegetables with renewed purpose. The monotony of their past began to fade, replaced with a newfound appreciation. One evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills, illuminating the farmland in shades of red and gold, a storm rolled in. Dark clouds gathered ominously above them, and the wind began to howl. "Annie!" Kevin shouted, realization flooding him as the tempest roared to life. She commanded, rallying them into action. Racing against the worsening storm, they secured loose items and tied down tarps. The world around them cracked and boomed as thunder echoed through the valleys. They fought against the raging wind like warriors, determined to protect the land they had grown to love. In that chaos, as raindrops poured down like arrows, something shifted again. They weren't just men trapped in a storm. They were protectors of this land, forging a bond against the elements. When the storm finally passed, they stood together, drenched but proud. "We did that," Jake exclaimed, a wide grin plastered on his face. Annie smiled, relief washing over her. "Yes, you did." Days turned into weeks, and with each sunrise they learned more about the farm, about themselves, and about each other. They were no longer crooks. They were men reclaiming their lives and their identities, diving headfirst into the nurturing of both soil and spirit. But as they prepared for the upcoming harvest festival, they faced a new kind of nervousness, one not born from their earlier exploits but from the anticipation of their transformation becoming public. Kevin asked quietly one evening, staring into the flickering fire. "They'll see what we've become," Annie replied calmly. "You're no longer just boys looking for an easy score." As festival day approached, the whole town buzzed with excitement. Neighbors gathered to celebrate the fruits of their labor, and Annie encouraged them all to participate. "You help distribute the goods," she said, her eyes glimmering. Mike asked, uncertain. "Yes, embrace what you've grown, share your story with the community." At dawn, they set up their stall, hearts racing with both excitement and anxiety. The sun cast long rays over the landscape, illuminating the vibrant harvest of vegetables. Then the townsfolk began to arrive. Familiar faces appeared, eyes flickering from produce to men standing behind it. As whispers rippled through the crowd, doubt wrapped its fingers around Kevin's heart. He wondered aloud. "They'll see what we've built together," Annie assured him. As families began to approach, they couldn't ignore the tension thickening the air. Kevin took a deep breath, stepping forward. We messed up pretty badly before," he began, voice trembling. "But this farm taught us hard work and respect." The crowd fell silent, shock etched on their faces. "I'm sorry for what we did. But we learned, and we want to share that with you," Mike added quietly, stepping beside Kevin. "I never thought I'd find honor in working the soil," Jake spoke with surprising strength. "But this is home." Just then, a familiar face emerged from the crowd, a neighbor who had once warned them of their predatory ways. "It's good to see you boys trying to do right," he said, a hint of skepticism still lingering. The question hung in the air, thick and tangible, a challenge that pressed against their souls. But before they could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A cacophony of noise erupted as a massive equipment truck roared into view. Their former accomplices had arrived, looking to settle the score. With eyes wide in horror, the men found themselves standing not just at the crossroads of their transformation, but at the brink of chaos that could upend everything they fought for. The looming faces of their past stared back, and at that moment they had to make a choice: stand and confront, or flee and hide. As tension crackled in the air like the storm they once faced, the reality settled in. They had come back to reclaim their lives, but would the shadows of their past let them move forward? The choice they made now could change the course of their futures forever.